Probably one of the more controversial topics of the last 10 Probably one of the more controversial topics of the last 10 to 20 years has been the use of pre-recorded backing tracks during live shows, particularly within the rock community. But it's certainly not limited to just one genre of music. The practice is certainly not anything new, but in recent years it's become much more commonplace, especially on the local level. And it can be very polarizing, especially between the older generations, the current big names of today, and even down to the up and comers. And now there are a lot of reasons why bands use tracks to sweeten up their sound when playing live. But the biggest question seems to be how much is too much? Some people think that backing tracks shouldn't be used at all. Some really don't care either way, and some think that because everyone does it, that bands need to use tracks in order to keep up with modern expectations. Now, my personal opinion is somewhere in between. For the record, my original band, Sunset Rebellion, does use some pre-recorded media and tracks in our live performances. Now, they're not particularly at the forefront of our live sound, and we don't use them to cover up anything that we're playing. Mostly, it's just some extra sound effects and some synths and different things that we're just unable to replicate live. Now, do we need them to play our songs? No. Can we play without them? Absolutely we can. But we just thought it would be cool to add them in. Now, occasionally there might be a backing vocal or two that pop up, which, for the record, that wasn't really my idea, but it's not really a hill I'm willing to die on either. But I think the difference here is that we're not miming any of our performances, and we're not claiming to sing or play anything that we're not actually singing or playing. I think those are very important distinctions to make. And another example is I also play in a Linkin Park tribute band. Now, for a band like that, when you're playing that material with as many electronic elements as Linkin Park songs have, the use of backing tracks is pretty much unavoidable, unless you happen to have a DJ who can produce those sounds in real time. Now, we don't have someone who can do that, but we do still have live vocals, guitars, bass, drums, and keyboards. Now, could we play those songs without using tracks? Technically, yes. But it wouldn't really be the same, and as a tribute band, we want to try and get as close to the original arrangements as we can. Now, my personal opinion on backing tracks as a practice, I will say that if I had the choice, if all other things are equal, I would much rather perform and see other bands perform as live as possible. Even if it requires a few extra musicians on stage to do so, I usually prefer to keep backing tracks to a minimum, wherever possible. Now, of course, I realize that this is not always possible, or at least not always cost-effective or practical. For example, if there's a particular sound effect or prominent instrument on one particular song, but it's not in the rest of the set, well then yeah, it wouldn't make sense to pay all the expenses to hire an extra musician or a 20-piece orchestra or whatever it is just to play that one part, especially if you're touring. And obviously not every band is going to be able to afford to hire a hired gun to supplement their sound live on stage. I totally understand that. Now, do I think that every band that uses backing tracks is somehow faking it or cheating? No, not necessarily. I do think as long as they're being honest and transparent about what they're doing and not trying to be sneaky or deceptive about it, then to me it's all fair game. And this doesn't include, and by the way, this doesn't include certain like live televised events, like whenever you see a band performing at something like the Olympics or the Super Bowl. Most of those, unfortunately, require bands to mime or lip sync in some cases because, just because of logistics and physically being able to control or run sound in certain environments and just the way television is set up. I don't really know a lot about that stuff personally, but I have heard from reliable sources that sometimes it's just not always possible to play 100% live at those big events like that. But maybe that's a topic for another video. As far as how much is too much, that's all subjective and a matter of opinion. But I will say that yes, it is possible, in my opinion, to overdo it when it comes to backing track usage. For example, I've seen many bands that they will pipe in backing vocals and then pretend to sing them on stage when it's obviously not their voices. And sometimes it could be, gang vocals that you don't even necessarily have to be the best singer to pull off live. So I mean that seems unnecessary. And sometimes it'll even, from what I hear, it'll even be like lead singers who are singing along to a track. Those are a little bit harder for me to spot, but I do hear that that happens sometimes. Um, there's another interesting example. I remember seeing this one band a few years ago, and I thought they were really good. But when it came time for a guitar solo, they had a full guitar solo playing on a track in the background. And this band already had, if I remember correctly, they already had two guitar players on stage. I just remember sitting there shaking my head, going like, why would you guys do this? If you don't want to play a solo, fine, but either do it yourselves or don't. But I mean, to their credit, I mean, they weren't trying to pantomime or fake that they were playing the solo. But it just, I don't know, it just seemed like an odd choice to me. I've even heard stories about bands that go on stage or on the road without a live bass guitarist, and they just use tracks instead of that, instead of having a bass player. And I gotta tell you guys, to me, that's pretty lame. Like, and I realize that coming from me, someone who has played bass in bands over the years, that might sound biased, but and I will say, in all fairness, that bass players are the most difficult position to fill in most bands for whatever reason. Um, that might also be another topic for another video. Sometimes bands just don't want to split the money with an extra guy, or I guess they don't want to cancel a gig because their bassist can't make it, or they think it's more trouble than it's worth. Again, everyone has their reasons. I understand all that. I'm just saying that as a musician and as a fan, I still think it's kind of lame to see a rock band that could have a bass player but chooses not to. And just, I don't know, like guitar, bass, and drums, those are like foundational instruments of rock and roll. And you know, I don't know. It doesn't feel right to me if I don't see that on stage without if I see guitars and drums on stage without a bass. I don't know. It just doesn't feel complete to me. And look, I understand that bands are hard to form and maintain. And that technology is so much easier now than it was, but I understand that bands are hard to maintain and that people are hard to work with. But most again, most good things require some effort. And I don't know, that like you should put some effort into things like that if you're going to be a band. That's just my opinion. Also, this argument that, well, everybody does it, see, that to me is not enough of a reason, not enough of a justification, in my opinion. If you are going to use backing tracks, I would personally prefer that you make it make sense, or at least not use it as a crutch. Now, for some bands and in some situations, the tracks might be linked up or synced up with certain lighting and visual production elements of your show. That makes sense. Nothing wrong with that at all, by the way. I just think that from a musical side of things, if your band is unable to perform at all under any circumstances without some of these digital enhancements, I don't think that's a good look. I mean, and just, I don't know, call me old fashioned, call me a purist, say whatever you want, but at a certain point, you have to ask yourself, what does playing live really mean? Or what does it really mean to you? And honestly, what does it say about your musical ability if you're so dependent on that? I don't know. I don't know. It's just not a good look. Um, I do understand the desire to sound as good on stage as possible. For me, though, I don't think it's always a requirement to sound exactly like you do on your record. And to me, that's kind of the beauty of playing live, is that yes, it can be risky. And you want to stay as close to the essence of the song as you can, but there's also an excitement factor of hearing bands play live, really play live. And the energy is different, the vibe can feel different, and there might be certain musical or vocal choices made spontaneously in the moment that can add to the experience. Now, I personally think if you're striving for note perfection and just one-to-one accuracy from to the studio while you're on stage, I feel like you might be missing the point of what it means to play live. And look, there's nothing wrong with being accurate and tight, of course. I'm just saying it's not everything. So, in short, do I think that there should be a rule that no backing tracks are allowed? No, I'm not saying that at all. But do I think that there should be a rule that you have to use backing tracks because everyone's doing it now? Absolutely not. It's up to every band to make their own choices. All I would recommend is that you at least be honest about the choices that you're making and all the motives behind it. That's all I'm saying. Thank you guys, as always, for tuning in. Make sure you hit like and subscribe. Feel free to check me out on Instagram and on X at JackXConnor. My links are in the description. Thanks for tuning in. You guys be good.